Hello, and welcome to this morning's author reading and conversation with Mary Lawson. I'm Rick Sickinger, Programming Chair of the Alice Munro Festival of the Short Story. When I'm not doing this, my day job is as Tourism Development Officer for the County of Huron, where I have the pleasure of promoting Huron County as a great visitor destination. The Alice Munro Festival of the Short Story, now in its 19th year, celebrates short stories and Canadian writers in the landscape that inspired Alice Munro. You can find out more about the festival by following us on Facebook or checking us out on our website, alicemunrofestival.ca. I would like to start this morning's event by acknowledging that Huron County, the land where we are coming from this morning, is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. We recognize the First Peoples' continued stewardship of the land and water, and that this territory was subject to the dish with one spoon wampum, under which multiple nations agreed to care for the land and resources by the Great Lakes in peace. We would also like to acknowledge and recognize the Upper Canada Treaty signed in regards to this land, which include Treaty Number 29 and Treaty Number 45.5, and our roles as treaty people committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation, gratitude, and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Our thoughts lie with everyone impacted by the tragic news that emerged over this past week regarding the former Kamloops Residential School. I would now like to turn it over to the moderator for this morning's event, Barbara Brown. Barbara is a member of the Alice Munro Festival of the Short Story Organizing Committee and is a co-owner of the Village Bookshop in Bayfield and will be guiding today's reading and discussion. I'm really looking forward to this morning's reading and conversation. Thank you for attending and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Rick, for the introduction. You took the first part of my page off, which is a great thing to have, a little less and more time for Mary. But I do welcome you all to the 19th Alice Munro Festival of Short Story. And it's been a privilege for me to be part of this festival to honor our Nobel laureate, Alice Munro. And we must never forget that. She is a Nobel laureate. And the purpose of the festival is to not only celebrate short stories, but to support emerging writers and build the profile of Canadian authors. And I must say that since I volunteered in the Bayfield Library for a number of years, and since a number of us saved a bookshop in Bayfield, I'm astounded at the marvelous Canadian authors that we have out there. So I would encourage you to spend more time reading Canadian authors. So I welcome you all, and good morning, and I would have to say good afternoon to Mary since she's in England. We have about 50 minutes to discuss Mary's new book, A Town Called Solace, and it probably won't be long enough, certainly for me, but it will give you a flavor of her book and the way she writes. Mary will read several passages from her book to introduce us to her characters. Mary and I will have the opportunity then to have a chat, and I have a few questions to pose to her, and then we'll be leaving time for the audience. I believe you're to post your questions with your name, and we'll get to them later in the show. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Mary, who is Zooming from her home in Kingston upon Thames, near London in England, where she has lived for the past 5 decades. Mary, believe it or not, was raised in a small town quite close to us, Blackwell, near Sarnia, but I think it's part of Sarnia now, sort of as a suburb. But she spent all of her summers at her grandparents' cottage in northern Ontario, which at the time we would have called Muskoka, which has provided, and you will see in this book, and she may call on her other books to show how influential her summers at the cottage have influenced her writing. Her first book, Crow Lake, was published in 2002 to great acclaim, and I think that was much to Mary's surprise because she had had several rejections prior to that. This was followed by The Other Side of the Bridge, Road Ends, and this year, A Town Called Solace. Her books have been longlisted, shortlisted, and winner of numerous book awards. All have been national and international bestsellers. I don't recall how many languages they have been translated into, but it's numerous. And I know that she is on the curriculum both in high schools and universities. It's amazing. It's wonderful. Mary started out writing short stories because she said she needed to make money for the family. And these short stories were sent off to women's magazines. Crow Lake was one such story. And in a recent interview with Sarah Lang at the Globe and Mail, Mary told Sarah that her editor suggested she should turn it into a novel because you write best when you write about your home. Mary said what she was saying is that I had finally found my voice and its accent is Canadian. And after all her years in England, you will hear that Mary still has her Canadian voice. Mary is an esteemed Canadian author, and we are delighted to have Mary with us this year at the Alice Munro Festival of the Short Story. So welcome, Mary.
It is such a pleasure to be here, and it is such an honor to have my name spoken in the same sentence as Alice Munro, who is essentially the greatest of the great. She is a magnificent storyteller, and there is nobody to touch her. So to be in the same area at the moment is truly marvelous, and I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be in Canada at all because what with COVID and all, this could very well not have happened, but thanks to the miracles of technology, I'm here. And you've been good enough to invite me at a time when it isn't the middle of the night, our time, which is really great and makes a considerable change. I've been talking in the middle of the night since the book came out. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here.
That's wonderful. I'd like everybody to notice that she has on maple leaf earrings this morning.
Oh, yes, you've got to see them. Now, I'm told that they are real maple leaves that were dipped in something or other. And you can see through them because they were either in an advanced state of decay when they were dipped or the dipping did something to them. But anyway, I'm waving the flag, as you can see.
Right. So I have them on your ears and in your voice, your Canadian roots.
Yes, I'm Canadian.
So the Town of Solace is told in separate chapters by three very different characters: Clara, Elizabeth, or Mrs. Orchard, as she's called by Clara, and Liam. So I'd like to start our conversation, Mary, with two questions. What inspired you to write A Town Called Solace? And how do the characters, Clara, and I'll call her Elizabeth, and Liam as well, as the plot unfold from that original inspiration?
Ideas are my biggest problem as a writer. It takes me a long time. I was more than a year without any idea for another book after I finished Road Ends. And finally, an image came into my mind, and I don't know where from, and it kind of bothers me, of a child standing at a window of, say, the living room in her house, the side window, and she's looking out into the side window of the house next door, which is owned by an old woman whom she adores by the name of Mrs. Orchard. And I knew nothing to begin with except I had this image. And I thought, okay, so who is she? What's her story? What's she looking at? She was looking at 4 big boxes that were being carried into the living room by a man who basically shouldn't be there. It was Mrs. Orchard's house. And Mrs. Orchard had gone into hospital asking Clara if she would look after her cat, Moses, while she was gone, and saying that she wouldn't be long. But she has been long. And now, here comes this man who doesn't belong there, produces the key and lets himself into her house. And she doesn't know what's going on. And I thought, Okay, that's part of it, but that's not enough for her story. And then I had a stroke of luck. Well, shouldn't call it luck, really. I was listening to the news, and there was an interview with the parents of a girl who had gone missing. One of these terrible, devastating interviews where they appealed to the public for information if they knew anything, if they had seen the girl. And as is always the case with these dreadful interviews, quite rightly, the siblings were not present. But I suddenly thought about the siblings, and I thought, what must it be like for them? Because we can see what it's like for the parents, but particularly if they're too young to know what's going on, in which case the parents will try very hard to protect them from what's going on and will probably say everything's okay. It is going to be quite traumatic. And I thought, well, perhaps that is the situation with Clara. I decided her name was Clara. Perhaps she has, shall we say, an older sister, Rose, who had a flaming row with their mother and stormed out saying, "You'll never see me again," which was the sort of thing that Rose was prone to say, but they haven't. And it's been weeks. And Clara has convinced herself that if she doesn't stand at the window and watch for Rose, Rose won't come back. So I thought, okay, that's her story. How about the guy next door? I couldn't get a handle on him at all. I couldn't figure out who he was or what his story might be. So I abandoned him and went to Mrs. Orchard in hospital and started pondering what her story might be. Nobody came to visit her, which could be because of the roads up there back then. They were absolutely appalling, take it from me. And it could also be because she had no family, and I decided that was the case. Her husband has been dead for 8 years, and she has not entirely been able to accept this. And she talks to him all the time inside her head. Also, she had no children, I decided. She was a kindergarten teacher, adored children, and it was the great tragedy of her life that she was unable to have children. And I thought, this is pretty grim. We're going to need some light relief here. So I decided a family moved in next door, and they had 3 children. And this was down in Guelph. This was not up in Solace. It was down in Guelph, and the husband, taught at the Agricultural College in Guelph because my grandfather taught at the Agricultural College in Guelph, so I was on firm ground there. And I decided that there were 2 little girls, aged 6, and a little boy named Liam, aged 3. And that Liam and Mrs. Orchard developed a relationship. They became close. She adored that little boy. And I thought, hang on a moment, what are we talking about in terms of date here? Elizabeth is 72, which was my age when I started writing her. And this is 1972. So we're back in the late 30s, early 40s, if she's been trying for years to have a child, which means that possibly that fits with the guy next door being in his mid-30s and being Liam, the little boy, back from her early married life. So I thought, okay, now I can go back to Liam. But I had a really hard time getting a handle on him. All I could see was that he has arrived in this northern town He's monumentally unimpressed with it and with the North in general. Way too many trees. He's a city boy. He has just divorced his wife. He has just walked out of his job, and he's in a bad state. And the bad state has been kind of his permanent position for a long time, and it dates back to his childhood. So the story is, how does his tale of his childhood and his life since link with Mrs. Orchard and then with Clara? He was the hardest character by miles to write. But in the end, he became my favorite character, probably for that reason, because I spent so much time with him. Anyway, those are the three essential characters.
Could you read some selections from your book, please, and introduce us to these characters?
Okay.
And perhaps you could start with Clara, since she's the one that you open with in the book. And
yes, I will start with at the beginning, so to speak, page 1. There were 4 boxes, big ones. They must have lots of things in them because they were heavy. You could tell by the way the man walked when he carried them in, stooping over, knees bent. He brought them right into Mrs. Orchard's house next door to Clara's that first evening and put them on the floor in the living room and then just left them there. That meant that the boxes didn't have necessary things in them, things he'd need right away, like pajamas, or he'd have unpacked them. The boxes were in the middle of the floor, which made Clara fidgety. Every time the man came into the living room, he had to walk around them. If he put them against a wall, he wouldn't have had to do that, and it would have looked much neater. And why would he bring them in from his car and then not unpack them? At first, Clara had thought that it meant he was delivering them for Mrs. Orchard, and she would unpack them herself when she got home. But she hadn't come home, and the boxes were still there, and so was the man, who didn't belong. He'd driven up in a big blue car just as the light was starting to fade, exactly 12 days after Rose ran away. 12 days was a week and 5 days. Clara had been standing in her usual place at the living room window, trying not to listen to her mother, who was talking on the phone to Sergeant Barnes. The phone was in the hall, which meant that you could hear people talking on it no matter what room you were in. Clara's mother was shouting at the policeman, 16! Rose is 16 years old, in case you'd forgotten. She's a child. Her voice was cracking. Clara put her hands over her ears and hummed loudly to herself, pressing her face against the window until her nose was squashed flat. Her humming kept breaking up into short bursts because she had trouble breathing when her mother was upset, and she kept having to stop and gasp. But humming helped. When you hummed, you could feel the sound inside you as well as hearing it. It felt like a bumblebee buzzing. If you concentrated on the feel and the sound, you could manage not to think about anything else. There was a scrunching noise, louder than the hum, the noise made by wheels on gravel, and the big blue car rolled into Mrs. Orchard's driveway. Clara had never seen the car before. It was fancy and had what looked like wings at the back, and it was light blue. At another time, a safe time, Clara might have liked it, but this wasn't a safe time, and she wanted everything to be exactly as it had always been. No unfamiliar cars in driveways. The engine stopped, and a strange man got out. He walked over to the porch, climbed the steps, crossed to the front door, and took some keys out of his trouser pocket. He unlocked the door and went inside. Clara was shocked. Where had he got the keys? He shouldn't have them. Mrs. Orchard had told her that there were 3 sets of keys, one for the front, one for the back, and Mrs. Orchard had one set. Mrs. Joyce, who came in to clean once a week, had another, and Clara had the third. Clara wanted to tell her mother, who was no longer on the phone, but her mother sometimes cried after speaking to the policeman, and her face got all red and blotchy, and it frightened Clara. And anyway, she couldn't leave her place at the window. If she failed to keep watch for her, Rose might not come home. So that's Clara. I then have to figure out what her personality was. I mean, how does she feel about this guy coming in? We know she's shocked. Is she fearful? I decided no, not exactly fearful. She was outraged. She's a fierce little character. 7 years old, I thought. Plenty old enough to know that when her parents say everything's going to be all right, they don't know everything's going to be all right because they are clearly beside themselves with worry. And now, to make matters worse, here comes this man. So that's her first chapter.
I don't see Clara as a precocious child.
No.
And thinking about a 7-year-old, she wants things to be consistent and stay the same and know that her parents love her. And if you don't tell a child what's going on, their imaginations go wild, and often their imaginations are worse than what's actually happening. So it does seem a bit unfair that her parents...
It does. You can understand it. I mean, we all want to protect our children from grief and pain of any sort. But it isn't fair because it's the same for us. Not knowing is an agony. And all she knows is that something terrifying and terrible has happened to Rose, because otherwise her parents wouldn't be so alarmed about her. Now then, logically, we'd move on to Liam, but like I say, at that stage, I couldn't figure out who he was. So the second chapter is Mrs. Orchard's chapter. The book rotates through Clara, Elizabeth, Liam, and they're all equal parts. The bit I'm going to read for Mrs. Orchard isn't her first chapter. In fact, it's the day that she meets Liam for the first time. I'm reading from a fairly large bit, and I'm hacking bits out of it to shorten it, so it may be a bit disjointed, but please excuse me. She speaks always to her husband. In her mind, he's still with her. She's not loopy. She's perfectly sane. But she carries on conversation. Actually, I talk to my husband when he's not in the room. You know, I think we all do it to some degree. And I think we frequently do it with people that we're very close to after their death. Anyway, she says, "Do you remember the day we met him, Charles? August the 24th, 1940. The Blitz on London had begun the previous night. We listened to the BBC on the wireless every evening, and every evening the news was worse. But to return to Liam, Rel Kane had just arrived in Guelph, from Queens, I think. You may have been involved in recruiting him, I don't recall. Either you told him that the house next door to ours was up for sale, or it was pure coincidence that they moved him there. I don't recall that either. I do remember you telling me that he was married and that you thought, but weren't sure, he had children. That detail stuck in my mind. I was in bad shape at the time. 6 weeks earlier, I had had my 5th miscarriage, this one at almost 6 months. They let me hold our child, our son, before they took him away. He struggled to live, but could not. I watched the new family arrive from behind our living room curtains, that's how bad it was. As if the mere sight of someone else's children might blow me in too. There was a vacant lot between our houses, so they were 100 yards away, and I couldn't make out faces, but I saw that there were 3 young children, 2 girls and a little boy. I could neither look at them nor tear my eyes away. Courtesy demanded that we go over and welcome the newcomers to the neighbourhood, but I couldn't manage it. You went on your own when you got home from work. No doubt you said I was unwell, which was perfectly true. But the next day you persuaded me that we must invite them around for a cup of tea. We have to do it, Elizabeth, you said. They are our neighbours, and Ralph is going to be a colleague. We cannot pretend they don't exist. So she's appalled by this idea, but Charles insists, and he does persuade her. And they invite them for the Saturday. She makes a couple of cakes and some cookies and does all the right thing, but she remains absolutely terrified that when they arrive, she will break down, but she'll open her mouth and nothing will come out of it but a howl. When the knock came at the door, I followed you fearfully to greet our guests. They were grouped on the porch. The girls, I saw that they were twins, in front, the parents behind. The little boy, who was about 3, hanging back, clinging onto his mother's skirt, trying to drag her in the opposite direction. He had one foot braced against her shoe and the other knee bent for maximum traction, and he was hauling so hard and leaning back so far he was almost parallel to the ground. I was so distracted by this tug-of-war that I scarcely noticed Ralph and the girls. I'm not sure I even said hello to them. Annette turned anxiously towards me. I had stepped out onto the porch. I'm so sorry, she said breathlessly. I'm afraid he isn't very good with strangers. Liam, say hello to Mrs. Orchard. Liam did not. He kept right on hauling. It seemed to me, though, that if you considered things from his point of view, his behaviour was entirely understandable. Just a couple of days earlier, he had been uprooted from the home he knew and dumped down in one that he didn't know and had not been consulted about. He didn't like it. He didn't like anything that was going on in his life, and in particular, he didn't like the idea of going to yet another new house and spending the afternoon with a nice lady and gentleman he'd never met before. In other words, he wanted to meet me every bit as little as I had wanted, a minute previously, to meet him. In fact, he looked so much like I felt that incredibly I almost laughed. I became aware of the most remarkable lightening of my mood. I said, "Hello, Liam. Would you like to come in and have a cookie?" I glanced quickly at his mother and she nodded, smiling weakly. I guessed that she was embarrassed by this poor showing at our first meeting. She may have heard that I'd been a kindergarten teacher and feared that I would judge her incompetent, which at that stage I did not. It was clear that he was a strong-willed child and quite a handful. My bribe was beneath Liam's dignity and he rightly paid no attention to it, though he did shoot a quick look at me as if trying to gauge the quality of cookie this horrible lady might produce. I said, "Or there's chocolate cake. Would you like some chocolate cake, Liam?" This time there was clear hesitation, and I thought for a moment I had won. But no, he started hauling again. For a 3-year-old, he drove a hard bargain. I shot my last bolt. "Would you like to have some cake and a cookie out here on the porch, Liam? You could sit on the step and you wouldn't have to talk to anyone." He stopped hauling and stood hanging at a 45-degree angle from his mother's skirt, head down, thinking hard. I knew his decision before he did. "Is that all right?" I said, sotto voce to Annette. She said, "Well, if you're sure you don't mind." So that was what happened. Liam sat on our porch steps, and ate a large piece of chocolate cake and 2 chocolate chip cookies more or less simultaneously. We have no photo of it, but I don't need one. It is etched on my brain. It's one of the pictures I plan to take into eternity with me, my love. Liam, on the steps, age 3.
Could you go ahead and read the last character?
Yes, Liam himself. And I'm reading from when he arrives in this godforsaken town in the north. After he'd brought in the boxes and taken his suitcase upstairs, there was still a bit of light in the sky, so he decided to walk into the centre of town and see what it had to offer. The answer was not much. There were 2 streets at right angles to each other, one running north-south parallel to the lake, the other running east from the lake for a couple of blocks before petering out altogether at the edge of the woods. Apart from some small farms, a newish secondary school all on its own in the middle of a field, a sawmill and a lumber camp a couple of miles out of town, and that was it. Solace, Northern Ontario, as of September 1972. On the road leading away from the lake, there was a hardware store, a small, ugly modern library, 2 bars, one of them with a police station right next door, a drugstore and 2 cafes. Liam realized he was hungry at the same time that he realized both cafes were closed. In fact, he looked about him. Everything was closed. Not only that, there was no one, not a single soul on the street. Apart from a couple of dogs sniffing around outside the cafes, he was on his own. He looked at his watch. Just after 7. Just after 7 on a Thursday evening, and the place was a ghost town. For an irrational moment, he wondered if his brain was making the whole thing up. Not just this lonely northern town carved out of the wilderness, but everything. Fiona, the past 8 years, his so-called career, his life. Several times in the course of the day's drive, he'd become aware that he wasn't concentrating. He felt dazed. He hadn't been sleeping well and had a dull, persistent headache. From time to time, he'd have the sensation of things slipping, a dizziness, as if inside his head things were sliding down a steep hill. On the drive, he kept telling himself that it was tiredness, and he told himself that again now. Go back to the house, he thought, find something to eat, and go to bed. There was a jar of cookies on the counter. He made himself a cup of coffee, added 2 teaspoons of sugar to make up for the lack of milk, and took it plus the jar of cookies into the living room. For an hour, he chain ate slightly stale cookies and watched fuzzy images waver about on the TV. At 10, he went upstairs. He identified Mrs. Orchard's room, the one that looked lived in, left it undisturbed, and chose one at the back of the house for himself. The bed was made up, which was a relief. He took off his clothes, left them lying where he dropped them, and got in. He lay for a minute, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion, then switched off the bedside light, closed his eyes, and instantly became prey to all the thoughts he had been fighting to keep at bay during the long drive north. The slow, relentless disintegration of his marriage, the decision to split, the months of increasingly savage disputes over the house, the final never-to-be-forgotten evening back at what once had been home to decide the division of possessions. You take it, you always liked it more than I did. It was your birthday present. I bought it for you. It's yours. I don't want it. Take it or junk it. The books, records, ornaments, the Greek vase, souvenir of that long-anticipated, once-in-a-lifetime holiday, which had been riven from arrival to departure by quarrels and resentment. Bed linen, cutlery, the dinner service. Fiona wrapping crystal wine glasses in newspaper, wrapping so fast, so hard that the stem of one of them snapped. Her scalding tears. A marriage, drawn and quartered, piled into cardboard boxes, 7 of hers, 4 of his, in the middle of a living room floor. And then the next day, he gets up and goes shopping at the store and comes home with his groceries and unloads them, and a police car drives into the driveway, and he discovers that he is a possible suspect in a crime. So his life just keeps getting better and better.
Could I just go back to Elizabeth for a minute? You did mention it. You tell her story as she talks to her dead husband. I worked in the area of bereavement support for 25 years, and that's a very, very common occurrence. But many women are uncomfortable sharing that with others because they feel they might be seen as crazy. What made you tell Elizabeth's story in talking to her dead husband?
Well, when I started, I couldn't make her work either, which was dispiriting because I'd just drawn a blank with Liam. I was writing her in the third person, which the other two are. And her story was so intense, and I couldn't seem to convey it. I couldn't get it across properly. And I thought, I'll turn it into the first person, which is more immediate. You are right, and there isn't an intermediary between you. There's not a he said, she said. You're right in her soul, so to speak. And she will be going over things in her mind. And I thought she will tell them to her husband. So it was, in that sense, a device, but I thought, given how very close they were, it was more than likely. And also, given what happened in her relationship with Liam, she will still be trying to make sense of it herself. And she will be explaining it to herself as well as to him. So it was kind of accidental. It was because I couldn't make it work in the conventional sense. But I did find that it was a far more immediate way of telling her backstory and trying to make sense of it all.
One thing that happened, of course, as she's telling her story, and you alluded to it, is that it sort of broke through her denial as she was telling him, Charles, his name, and finally acknowledged that he had been right and that she had been wrong in what happened. But at the same time, sort of in acknowledging that, I probably wouldn't have changed anything. I really enjoyed the way that you used her husband to tell her story. I noticed that there's lots of things going on in the book, but family complexities play a key role in the book, and particularly one that interested me was mothers and mothering. And I wondered if you could discuss how mothering gets played out in the book, and are there any other dynamics, family dynamics, that are central to the plot?
I have to tell you one of my all-time favorite questions here from an audience. I think it was while I was writing Road Ends, but I was touring with The Other Side of the Bridge, and a woman in the audience afterwards stuck up her hand and said, "Why are all the mothers in your books either useless or dead?" And I thought that was such a good question. But unfortunately, I have no idea of the answer. I don't know why my mothers are always... I'm sure I was a brilliant mother, but I'm not the person to judge. I don't know why they are. But anyway, here we are again in another book. Now, it's true that Clara's mother is just so distraught that she, at this time, is not a good mother to Clara. And I don't imagine that is unusual in the circumstances. In fact, I know it's not, because I was reading an interview with someone just the other day who said she looks back on that time with utter despair at herself because she was unable to provide the comfort that her children needed. She was just in too poor a state. But Liam's mother is another story. I don't want to give too much away, but there are children who are made almost pariahs in their own family. And that happens with Liam. And there is a good reason, quite apart from the fact that Annette is exhausted. She has twin girls, then she has Liam, but when she moves in, she discovers that she is pregnant again, and she fears, and she's correct, that it's twins again. So she ends up having 5 children under 6 years old, or just 6 years old. And she is not a born mother. She does not handle this easily. And she is just beside herself. And when things start to go wrong between a parent and child, it can be very hard to break out of that. And then things get worse for reasons that I can't give away now. And I had sympathy for Annette, but it is true that Liam's childhood was absolutely devastating. My sister is a psychotherapist, and I consulted her extensively about this while I was writing, trying to figure out what the consequences are of a child growing up without love. And it was really, he was a very difficult character to write. And I couldn't get to grips with him. I could understand the nurture side of it, in the nurture-nature debate. It was clear enough what the nurture had been like. But what was the nature? Because the final outcome would depend on his personality and who he was at the core of him, underneath the experiences that he had been through. And I didn't manage to work that out for the first third of the book, more than a third of the book. It wasn't until he first met Clara that I realized who he was. It was in the course of his first conversation with her. And actually, I have found in the past that a good way to access somebody, to figure out what they're like, is to put them with another character and have a conversation between them, have a scene with the two of them in, and see what transpires. And that definitely worked with Liam. So I hope I've answered your question as well as I can without giving things away.
Yes, I know that is a bit of a dilemma. I want to ask lots of questions, but I know that we would give away the plot to the audience. Alice Munro said she was drawn to writing about small towns because the small town is like a stage for human lives. Would this hold true for you in your books? Because they take place in small communities, or would there be different reasons?
No, that would be true. I live outside of London, big city, and that was a shock to the system, I can tell you. I grew up in an isolated farming community in southern Ontario, and then spent the 3 summer months up in the north, which was more isolated still. So I wasn't accustomed to that. And I can remember when I was in my teens being absolutely desperate to leave home because everybody knew me and knew my parents, and in some cases knew my grandparents. And they had preconceptions about who I should be and who I would turn out to be. And I actually come back to that in the second book, The Other Side of the Bridge. There's a character in there who feels similarly, that he's trapped in this community that knows him too well. I was frantic to get out. But when I started writing, it was my childhood that came back. There was a setting it. I set the short story that became I set it in Canada because there was a comfort in doing that. I'd been writing for women's magazines, and they had strict requirements. One of them was that you had to set the book in the UK, the short story in UK, and another was that it had to be contemporary. It had to be the here and now. And the third, which was the most onerous, was that it had to be about a boy and a girl. Really not what I was interested in writing about. And I remember thinking back then that the only person that I knew who could develop character and relationships in the short story form was Alice Munro. And I thought, I am never going to manage that. I'm going to have to write a book. So I wrote a book that wasn't any good. It took me 5 years, and eventually I shredded it. And then I went back to short stories, but that was because I had an idea for a story that I desperately wanted to write, based on a child who adores her older brother. And I set it in Canada just for myself. I knew this story wouldn't sell, so I could write it however I liked. And I set it in a small farming community because I hate doing research. And I set it in the time of my own childhood because I hate doing research. And I absolutely loved writing it because I knew how people would talk. I knew the rules they lived their lives by. I knew the things that were important to them. All these things which gave me an authority that I had never had when I wrote stories set in England, even though they were set in the present day, because I think I lacked the cultural background. Whereas when I wrote about home, I had it. And that was the short story. When I finished it, I sent it to one of the magazines, the one that had published most of my stories. And the editor phoned and said, Mary, you know this is not our sort of thing, but I really love it and I'm going to publish it anyway. But also, you've got a novel here and it has to be set in Canada. Your writing is on another level when you write about your home. So I can't tell you how absolutely overjoyed I was to hear that, because she was, as you mentioned, saying that I had found my voice and that it was Canadian. And that gave me the freedom to write what I wanted to write, where I wanted to write it. And I have carried on doing that. It has just been such a joy, and it's given me an excuse to go home even more frequently than I already do and go up north, properly north of the Muskoka area. I moved everything way up there because Muskoka is no longer isolated, and I need a sense of isolation. So I moved it up north and west of Temiskaming, where you can still find some solitude. And I set the books up there, and I have simply loved writing them. So that's the reason. It's kind of like Alice Munro, but I would say that in my case, it's not just the small town, it is also the landscape itself that is the main attraction for me.
I think that holds true for both you and Alice Munro. She talks about in her book Huron County, and or she describes her landscape. So she does sort of southwestern Ontario and the golden wheat and the decaying barns, and you've got the billion-year-old rocks, and I always think it's deep and dark, the water, and it's wonderful for both of you actually to have talked about Ontario, because it is truly a lovely, lovely province. I have one last question, and our time again is escaping on us. So if you could tell me a little bit about your writing process. I have this image that you're writing so effortless. You pick up a pen and you start writing, or you tick away on your computer and the words flow out through your fingertips. Voila, there is the book. And then you tell us that it took you 7 years to write, and I was completely surprised at that. So in a few words or less, can you tell us about your writing process?
I so wish it was as you suggest. That would be brilliant. The first thing to say is I have no technique. I have never managed to learn how to do this. I keep thinking that eventually I will figure it out. the best thing to do, I am convinced, is to work out in your mind what is going to happen and to have a plot and a timeline and to write rationally and logically. And I appear to be incapable of doing any of those things. The books are character driven. I start with a character. I have no idea what is going to happen, what the plot will be, what the ending will be, what the story will be. All I know is that I've got some interesting characters here, and it'll be fun to see what happens to them. But it's a matter of trial and error, which is why I am so endlessly slow. I go down one dead end after another and have to come back and restart and try and work it through. And then eventually, when I've got all three stories, try and make them hang together logically. At that stage, I do write a timeline. Because otherwise it's just insane. But it's not a sensible way to write, and I really wish I could manage to do it otherwise.
I don't want to wait 7 years for your next one. I don't. I don't. I turn to a couple of questions that have been posted, and in keeping with your writing process, Carol asks, during your literary experience, did you belong to a writers group or still do?
I did belong to a writers group. I was already published writing short stories when I joined, but I found it really good, partly because we were discussing how it was done, only it was never about novels, it was about poetry or short stories, but nonetheless, it made me a little bit more analytical. And also because it is a pretty lonely business here.
Writing is.
My kids were off at school. My husband traveled quite a lot, and I sat at my desk alone all day. So one morning a week to go to a writer's group was really good. And you were with people who were also obsessed with writing. I will say that the only possible reason for writing a novel, for sure, is that you love writing, because your chances of getting published depend so hugely on luck. It's a crazy business. You very politely said that I was turned down by several publishers. I was turned down by one publisher after another for 4 years. This is Crow Lake. And then finally, there was a bidding war and everybody wanted it.
It's amazing.
It was the same word for word down to the last punctuation mark. It was the same book, but first nobody wanted it and then everybody did. So it's not a sensible career, but to be with other people who adored writing just for its own sake was really good. That it gave me a lot of support.
And one other question, and I'll close with this one. It's I grew up in Sarnia and know the Blackwell area well. It's wonderful. Oh. It's wonderful to meet. It's wonderful to meet an author who comes from that area. And she says, "Have you ever been back?"
Oh yes. Oh, absolutely. I was back 2 years ago and took out. My husband and I and my sister took out 3 friends of my mother's who still lived there, so that I could pick their brains. Well, no, so that I could see them. The Blackwell area and Sarnia in general have been fabulously supportive of the books, but the people of Blackwell in particular have been marvelous, and I see them every time I go over. My generation moved, of course. We are no longer there, but my parents' generation, some of them are still there, and we go and see them. And I wanted to know what sort of cakes Elizabeth would have made in the 40s. So I picked their brains, and they gave me that. But yes, I go back. I I go north as
Well,
well.
the next time you come back, you'll have to drive through Goderich and Bayfield and Wingham, all the places that Alice Munro wrote about and visited. I've not met her myself, but I have seen her several times enjoying a meal in a restaurant. So, but I need to draw this to a close. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's amazing to me that in reading your books, how they're just delightful, they're satisfying to read. You'll chuckle, you'll laugh, you'll feel sad, you'll cry, you actually even get angry at a couple of people. And I encourage everybody in the audience to read it. It's really worthwhile, and all her books as well. You can find copies of the book. They're all in the library. Rick has made sure that they're available there. You can get them at the Village Bookshop as well. I'd like to stop and thank our sponsors, the County of Huron, Township of Northern Huron, Ontario Arts Council, Dr. Maria Gear, Royal Homes, Capital Power, as well as Microwave Basics and Schenck Legal. And there are up on the screen some other ones to thank as well. I thank the audience for joining us today. Next year will be the 20th year of the Alice Munro Festival of Short Stories. And it's always the first weekend in May. And hopefully we can meet in person next time. And again, Mary, I want to thank you. It's been absolute pleasure for me. Just as a quick aside, I remember my friend, the librarian, one day, we were sitting next to Alice Munro in the restaurant, and Annie got up, went over, and just sort of stared at her. And I said, she says, she's my rock star. And yeah, so you border on that for me as well. So I just thank you very much for joining us. Very much.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a delightful afternoon. Thank you, and thank you to everybody for coming. It's really good, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Mary. Bye-bye.